All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming again. My name is Marcella Wiget, and I'm an archivist right here in the State Archives at the Kansas Historical Society. So Cliff and I are going to be telling you, going right into what Sherry left you with, and talking about arrangement and description, the processing of the collections once you've received them, once you've accessioned them into your collections. So there's a pretty brief overview of what we'll be talking about today, but I'm not going to spend much time on this because we got a lot of material to cover and we want to get right into it. So hopefully during the acquisition process, you've actually gone through the appraisal process before deciding whether or not to take something. Hopefully it hasn't just been dumped on your desk one day without any contact information left behind. I know I've walked in many mornings or many afternoons after lunch and gone, I don't remember putting that there. So we've all been there, but hopefully you haven't had that happen to you. So when you're getting that, when you're creating the accession record, you're going to be doing some kind of initial survey, initial appraisal of what you're looking at. And that initial appraisal is going to be your very first stab at arrangement and description of what you've received. In other words, the process that your institution goes through in order to make sense of the material, organize it, and talk about it in a way that will make it accessible to your audience, so they know they can access it, and so they know whether or not it's something that they want to access in the first place. Sometimes that initial description, that initial examination, might be the only time that you actually bother to arrange and describe something. Hopefully that's only happening with really small collections. Or maybe it just becomes part of your workflow because you don't have time to go back again and again to a collection because you have limited time, you have limited resources, you have limited staff. And it's all probably going to depend on how significant a priority individual collections are to your institution. So yeah, actually let me go back. When you're sending a deed of gift, as Sherry mentioned, you're giving some kind of description to the owner of what they've given you. That's both so that you can check off with the owner, yeah, we're all talking about the same thing. And also it's really useful for you later on, years and years from now, for your institution, to go back and say, okay, when did we receive that and from whom did we get it? And just to check on that kind of information, because you'll find yourself digging through your accession records, your collection files, for reasons you never would have expected when you first created that initial paperwork. So having viewed a lot of deed of gifts and having written a few myself, I know that the more descriptive you can be in those deeds and in any other temporary receipts or accession paperwork, the more it'll help you track down information later. One sad iron is not helpful when your museum already owns 20. 2 photographs of downtown being flooded, it's a little bit better, but it's still not quite as useful as 2 photos of North Topeka and Kansas Avenue during the height and aftermath of the 1903 flood. You'll hopefully be able to figure it out from there, especially if those photos have the accession number written on them. So you're already describing the materials just by writing the deed of gift. You might already be arranging them too, although we'll talk more in a bit about how much and when to rearrange materials. In some instances, such as if all the new accession consists of are these 2 photos of downtown during the 1903 flood, then that level of description may be sufficient and you can move on to the next project. In other words, the acquisition process and the processing process go hand in hand. Depending on the size of your staff or your volunteer force, you might indeed have different people doing each piece of the puzzle, in which case that acquisition paperwork and talking to the person who acquired the collection is going to be really important to give you some kind of idea of what you're getting into. On the other hand, at most small institutions, it's probably the same person doing both steps, namely you, and that's why you're all here today. So in which case, you probably already know from the beginning how difficult or how easy a process and a project this might be. So when deciding how much arrangement and description you're going to need to do on any given collection, you're going to need to survey that collection. And like I said, that initial survey was probably done as you were appraising the collection or somebody else is appraising the collection. And those kinds of surveys are sometimes very quick. It might just be a couple emails, it might be a really lengthy phone call, talking to the potential donor about what's in this collection, what do we care about. Sometimes if it's something really, really exciting and really, really cool and really, really unique, that'll be it. As Sherry pointed out, that doesn't happen very often. Sometimes it takes years. And sometimes also that initial survey might just be during the site visit when you're leafing through the materials to figure out, okay, is this what we want? Is this not what we want? I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague here, Cliff Hight from Kansas State University, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about surveying and developing your processing plan.
Hello everyone. I've learned a lesson by being involved in this. When you send your biographical information with some humorous content, don't be afraid to have it all show up. So, you might get the idea very shortly that I enjoy a little humor, so don't be afraid to laugh. We'll try and make this a pleasant experience for everybody. Now, as we talk about surveying collections, there are some components that I wanted to point out just so you know how to do it, because that sometimes helps. When you learn about the creator or the originator, that's basically the person who created the collection, created the records. Maybe they compiled everything together that they've been collecting into one collection, then gave it to you. So that's the person that you want to learn about, because that helps give you a little bit more of an understanding of the importance of the records, why they exist, why you might want to acquire them. And you can learn about that person by looking at reference works. Maybe you have clipping files in your collection already that you can go and look at, oh, this person is very important in the community, or we have no idea who this person is. Or they're well known in this field, whatever the case is. You also can talk to the donor. They often know the creator or they are the creator. So they can tell you a little bit more about why they kept all of this stuff. And then let's see, the main idea is to give context also for the users. This material was created for a certain reason, and the whole point of you acquiring it is for future users to have access to it. And so if that's your mindset, you want to be able to provide those future users with an understanding of why this is important enough to keep and make available to them. So keep that in mind as you learn about the creator and the originator. When you have to figure out the physical or digital size of the collection, there are a number of different ways to do that. Linear feet, cubic feet, items, running time, folders, files, bytes, and the list goes on and on. But the main idea is to try and be consistent so that you aren't doing both linear feet and cubic feet in the same collection, because that can be a little bit challenging to try and tabulate together. When we talk about linear feet, if any of you are not familiar with that idea, it's basically if the shelf is as long as my arms, it's 6 feet. It's basically you put the materials on a shelf, and however many shelf feet it takes up, that's linear feet. Cubic feet is a three-dimensional measurement. Say that box over there that Marcella is going to happily lift is about 1.25 or 1.5 cubic feet. And so that's how you measure that. You can measure the dimensions and figure it all out if you want to go crazy, or you can just estimate, and that works fairly well. Some people say that's a cubic foot box. It's technically a little bit more than that, but we're not going to get too specific with that. And then, like running time, if you've got audio tapes, videotapes, CDs, those type of materials, that's often the amount of time that is on that object. And I probably won't bore you with the rest of that, or you'll be falling asleep soon. So we're going to go on to talk about understanding the breadth and the intellectual scope of the collection. That's an important component because Sherry touched a lot on this as well. It helps you better understand if it's going to expand the collection that you've already acquired. Is it new, or is it repeating what you already have in your collection? That's what I was trying to say. So if it's new and it's going to give better understanding to your users, then that gives you more information about what you want to say as you arrange and describe it. All right, like an example that I thought about was, say you've got 15 folders filled with correspondence. That's great, but what's the subject matter? What subjects are in there? If you know about what the subjects are, then that's going to give a better understanding to the user of why they may want to look in those folders. And then talking about the provenance or original order, we're going to do definition time because it's always fun to read definitions. Provenance, the origin or source. It also can mean information regarding the origins, custody, and ownership of an item or collection, basically where it came from, who's had it over the years. It also sometimes can be called a custodial history. That basically says who's held it for years. Original order is, in our dream world, the organization and sequence of records established by the creator. That does not necessarily mean that original chaos is worthwhile, but the apex of archival world is to keep things in the original order, because we want to trust that the creators knew why they organized things the way they organized them, and we should respect that. In practice, we know that that's not always the case, and we'll talk more about that when we get into arrangement. So she asked if we establish provenance, is that the same thing as ownership? It tells you who has owned it or who has possessed it over time. So hopefully at some point you would figure out who the owner was, yeah. And that's where that deed of gift often will help you establish the provenance. When you sign that and you work with the donor, they can tell you a little bit more of the details of who has had it over time. So that helps flesh that out. All right, I think that we've hammered this one out pretty well. You have any other questions before we move on? So as I thought about some of the things that we want to do, have any of you had boxes that look like that in your place? Yeah. So sometimes you may come across boxes that are stacked like that and falling apart. And do you want the truth about this photo? At a previous place of employment, those were the museum's records. Some of the museum's records, yeah. That was fun. So as you talk about the challenges that you may face as you're surveying a collection, there are a number of things that you can think about. Are you addressing collections that are already in your backlog, or are you addressing collections that are coming in new to you? And I think both of those are fairly important to consider, because most of us have a backlog. I would guess almost all of us have a backlog, and that means collections that we have, but we don't really know what they are. We can't give them to the public because we don't really know what they are, or similar situations like that. If that's the case, if we have a backlog, then some of the things that we want to think about, some of the questions that we may want to ask as we're thinking about potential issues or concerns, is what is the provenance or the custodial history? Can we still document it? Do we have the paperwork to document it? If not, how do we effectively communicate that to our future staff, the people that are going to succeed us in our positions, other staff members who may look at it later on? Another question, is the physical organization recognizable? Is there original order? If not, then we better think about what are we going to do with this material to make it available to the users? Is there duplication? What we already have in our collection that's maybe already accessible, is the stuff in the backlog duplicating that? And if so, maybe we need to think about not even worrying about it. Maybe we should deaccession that. So another concept to think about. And then what's the general preservation situation? Is there a certain degree of deterioration that has already occurred? How much will continue? At what rate? Is there visible pest damage? Do you need to rehouse it? Do you need to reformat it? All of those questions can be considered as you look at your backlog. And then as you think about your arriving collections, the new ones, you can ask basically those similar questions, but then you also want to think about, do we have space? I think Sherry touched on that earlier. Do we have space for this new collection that's coming in? Do we have time to make it accessible? If not, then maybe we should think about, this is all part of that appraisal decision-making process, but it also can be part of the survey process. And then, if it's got all of these various formats, say it's audio tapes, film, maybe it's digital materials, paper, old newspaper, all of these different formats, how do we make these various formats accessible? If it's a 16 millimeter film and nobody's got a film projector, how are you going to make that accessible to the public? Because that's, again, your whole purpose of existence is to share the materials with people.
So yeah, when Cliff and I were talking about our presentation and trying to figure out what we thought we needed to cover. Privacy and confidentiality came up, and it's something that'll definitely come up as you're surveying a collection, either in your backlog or something new that's coming in, because, well, there's always problems. So my first caveat and disclaimer, everything that I tell you is not legal counsel and advice. I am not a lawyer, I just sometimes appear to play one. So there's some good news, mostly if you're dealing with government records. You've got a few places that you can go to look at things. And I know at least a few of you are from government repositories. So yes, one place to look is actually on the Kansas Historical Society's website. The State Records Board creates retention schedules for county level records. And oftentimes those retention schedules will give you an indication of whether information is restricted or not. It's not always the case. Some of the older retention schedules don't list that kind of information, but it's a good place to start. And one major restriction that's going to come up for government records is from the Kansas Open Records Act, KSA 45-221. And that's available on the legislature's website. And yes, I did include that link. And it's good to go to the website in both the retention schedules case and in the legislation's case, because things change. And if you're looking at a printout from 2005, you might not realize that, oh, they created a new subsection that's closing something else. I didn't know about that. So it might affect your work. So it's always good to periodically check that again for the most current information. And the nice thing about the Kansas Open Records Act, KORA, is that it has a general rule in KSA 45-221 subsection F that anything that's closed from public access under that statute has a general 70-year rule. So once it hits a 70-year cutoff date, theoretically, it's open access now. Anybody can look at it, doesn't matter. There's a big maybe in there though, because a lot of records are not closed, restricted access through KORA. They're restricted through other statutes. Adoption records, for example. I noticed when I was going through the local record schedules that abstract elections of returns are closed through something else. So there you're going to have to do a little more investigation, a little more digging into the statute to determine whether that statute states this exemption will expire after so many years, or whether it doesn't say anything like that, in which case you probably have to assume that those records are going to be closed forever, or those portions of those records are going to be closed forever. So that's going to again lead into questions of reappraisal. Do we really need to keep these records? Do we really need to keep these materials? Are they ever going to be open? Of course, a lot of you don't necessarily deal with government records. You're dealing with private collections, you're dealing with business records, church records, club records, other organizational records. So in those cases, hopefully there's a deed of gift. Hopefully, if it's something the donors decided to close, there'll be records for you to look at to determine, okay, they wanted this particular set of records closed for 20 years, or they wanted their entire collection closed for 10 years. Something like that, like Sherry was talking about in her presentation. Sometimes though, your institution might have to make a local decision after the fact, especially if the donor's been deceased for 50 years and you're dealing with a backlog, or in other instances where maybe the donor didn't realize what they were giving you because they were giving you such a large collection, or because they were in a hurry, whatever the case may be. There's always weird circumstances. So if you're going to decide that institutionally, it might be for something relatively minor, like their social security numbers on every single page. Those become a lot more common throughout the 20th century, so you might have to redact that information, mark it out with a pen, and then hand the photocopy over to the researcher, something like that. And that might be just something that you decide to do when a researcher requests a specific collection. Maybe it's bank account information. Maybe it's something a little more gray area, where there's some really deeply personal correspondence between a recently deceased local figure and another local figure who is not deceased yet. Maybe there's some political considerations where that personal correspondence involves members on your historical society's board. It's unfortunate, but you have to think about those kinds of considerations. What you want to do as much as possible is keep the materials open. That is why you're there. It's to keep things accessible. Yes, you had a question or a comment? The comments about his institution has a couple books of jail records that go back about a century. And he doesn't like to make that information public because, you know, well, hey, look, Grandpa Joe was in jail. It's kind of interesting because we get a lot of requests here at the Historical Society for the prison records from the state penitentiary. And I'm pretty sure if it's old enough, people can access it. They can't necessarily access the whole record, but they can access a lot of it. So it's something that you have to think carefully about. And like I said, try to keep it as open as possible because that's your purpose, your mission, is to make these materials accessible. If you are closing something, like Sherry was talking about, make it finite. Say it's going to be open by 2015, it's going to be open by 2020. And whatever decisions you end up making, document them. This will be helpful for your institution to be consistent about its policies. It's also necessary institutional memory for whoever takes over processing materials and providing access to them after you're gone. So whatever documentation you create, put it somewhere central and accessible. Maybe with the accession records, maybe if you keep a central place for all your processing records. We keep that kind of information in our collections management database. And we also keep note of this collection was closed until 2012, because sometimes we don't always get those access restricted stickers taken off, because that takes time. So that way there's somewhere to go to say, wait a second, I didn't think this collection was closed. You can be like, well, it was, but that's not anymore. That's enough on that. Now we're going to get into the real nuts and bolts of why we're here this afternoon. And Cliff's going to start you off with some arrangement tips and suggestions.
Before I get started, are there any questions about what we've discussed so far? Okay, good. Thanks for staying awake. We'll try to keep you that way for the next little bit. So what is, oh, there is a question, all right.
So the question's about if you've got boxes that have access restricted stickers or confidential stickers on them, and I'm assuming you're meaning once that's expired and it's no longer closed to public access. Yeah, generally if a researcher's coming asking for that specific collection, we'll try to take those stickers off when we're pulling. Yeah, and that involves a lot of conversations between the processing staff and the reference staff. It might not involve nearly as many conversations if there's just one person doing both. But at our institution, it's usually somebody's calling me or my supervisor saying, what's going on? And then we're going, oh yeah, we can take care of that. So yeah, definitely when a researcher comes for a collection, that's often the time that something gets done because maybe nobody's looked at it until that person's requested it.
As I was thinking about that situation, I wondered if there's a way to notify it at the beginning that says closed until such and such a date. And then you wouldn't even have to worry about removing the sticker because they would know by seeing that date, oh, it's after that date, it's open. So that might be a way to reduce some of that. So, all right, so in terms of arrangement, it's basically what you do with the stuff. But I'll give you the official definition now. The process of organizing materials with respect to their provenance and original order to protect their context and to achieve physical or intellectual control over the materials. I expect you all to remember that word for word for the quiz that will happen later. Another definition that might be a little bit more fun or easier. The organization and sequence of items within a collection. Again, another concept with arrangement. So as I've thought about arrangement and dealt with arrangement over the years, there are some things that have just always hit me about it. It is not static. There is no one size fits all. You can't train a monkey to do this. It requires some judgment. It requires understanding a little bit more about the creator and how they organize the records. If you think about office records, which is what I deal with a lot, maybe one office organizes these records in a certain way, but this office over here with the same types of records organizes it a different way. And so there has to be some respect to those efforts that they've made. And it's not worth our time always to go back and all make them the same way. Because if our purpose is to make them accessible, and we're spending all of our time changing the way that they were organized, we're not getting them as quickly accessible to the public as we should. So those are some ideas to keep in mind. So I do mention that it's flexible, it's adaptable, but ultimately, well, first let me tell you the story of it depends, because I'm sure you'll appreciate that. At a previous job that I had, I was working with people who wanted me just to tell them how to do it and make it that way every single time. So they would come to me and they would say, okay, this is the situation, what do I do? And I would say, well, it depends. And I'd ask them these questions about, okay, how did the original person have it organized? What are the most important elements in the collection? What subjects are really the ones that we really care about, or that our users are going to care about? So I'd ask them all these questions. And then they'd come back with another collection and somebody would say, well, how do you handle this? I said, well, it depends. And after a time, they suddenly started to realize that almost every response to those types of questions from me would be, it depends. And they were frustrated with that for a time. And then, about a year later, one of the staff members was catching the vision. And she was just really understanding that archival arrangement doesn't mean we always make an alphabetical list of everything that's in the collection. We don't just put everything in chronological order and call it good. Sometimes we leave it the way that the creators had it. And so she caught herself a number of times when she was talking with me about collections. I would turn it back on them sometimes and say, well, what do you think? And she caught herself a few times with me saying, well, it depends. I said, yes, I've trained you well. So it's not bad to realize that things aren't always going to be the same. You can't always do them the same way. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Now, as we talk about arrangement, there are different levels of arrangement. There's a concept in the archival world that's gained a lot of traction within the last 7 or 8 years called More Product, Less Process. It's based on an article that a couple of guys named Dennis Meisner and Mark Green wrote. And the Emporia students, you guys have probably taken some archives classes and heard about it. Some of the rest of you may have heard about it as well. But the whole idea is to reduce the amount of time that we take to make things accessible and just make them accessible quicker. And that requires some judgment of saying, okay, this set of 20 boxes of records will get used very little in the next 10 years. So we're going to do a very brief, this is what is in this collection, and then we're going to put it on the shelf, and we're going to call that good. That's our arrangement. Do nothing really with what's in the box. Just say these are the types of subjects and the types of materials in these boxes. That's how they arranged it and described it. Other times, if you know that it's going to get a lot of use, then you go into more detail, and you may folder every single item in there, or you may make sure every single photograph is in its own little envelope, and you may take a lot more time to make it accessible because you know the use over time will deteriorate those materials and you want to make them last longer. So your arrangement may be in a lot more detail. So sometimes you're looking at a repository level, which is the entire holdings. Sometimes you're looking at a record group or collection level. That's probably more frequently where we deal with arrangement. And then you get more detailed than that with a series, with a folder, and with an item. And so those are the various levels of arrangement that you can use as you're trying to figure out how did the people before me, or the people who gave this stuff to us, how did they have it organized? If it's business records from a local business, and say they had all of their accounts payable in one area, accounts receivable in another area, personnel records in another area, well, let's keep those all in that order. Most likely, they all got jumbled up when they got given to you, and so they may not be in quite such fine order, but you might be able to figure it out as you go through the materials. Oh, the stuff in this box over here should actually be with this stuff over here. I want to see if I've just like blown through the other 10 things that I had in plan to say. Some of the other things that I wanted to talk about, by the way, I should probably give credit. This listing of the levels of arrangement came from an archivist in the 1960s named Oliver Wendell Holmes, in case you all want to just put that in your little trivia bank. And as we think about some of the criteria, I've mentioned a couple of them. One or two of the ones that I didn't mention is the potential use. We've touched on that a little bit, But if we know that a lot of people will want to look at it, that may require a little bit more detailed arrangement than others, or more careful arrangement as well. You may have to really consider what's confidential or what's restricted by law to access. So there may be some internal policies that you have at your institution where that's going to really dictate what level of arrangement you provide. And as always, available staffing, available funding, that may dictate. We can't rehouse everything because we can't buy the boxes that we need, or we can't buy the folders that we need to rehouse everything. So those are all issues to keep in mind. Do any of you have questions or thoughts on what we've talked about regarding arrangements so far? All right, I knew I'd get one at least. Yes, that is a very good question. She was saying if you only provide a very basic description of, I have one box of accounts payable, but you don't say anything about what's in that box, then yes, there's less information that a researcher can go on to know if they want to look in that box. But if you're able to tell them this is the type of business it was, then knowing that type of business, they might be, generally that's what they're looking for. If they're looking for a specific name that's on the accounts payable, what they're going to find in that box might help, but it really doesn't give them a lot of information anyhow in accounts payable. So again, that's a trade-off that you have to consider when you're making that judgment. And again, it depends, right? So that's a good question though. And that's one of the trade-offs is researchers obviously will want the greatest level of detail that's possible, but are they willing to take the trade-off of it's going to take 5 years to make it accessible before they'll see it? Or would they rather have a more basic description so that they can have it available to them, for them to dig through the boxes in the next, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is. So that's a very good question though. All right, we're going to move on to systems of arrangement. So one of the things to consider when we've talked a little bit about provenance and original order. It is the preferred method. So my question is, why do you think that provenance and original order are concepts that really matter with arrangement? And I actually expect responses this time, so. Are they two separate systems? They're related, how's that? Right, that's a very good question though. They're related because provenance tells you basically who has owned it over the years. Now, over the years, has the original order shifted because of who has owned it? Or who's been responsible for it? So that's a good question. Yes? You have just got an A in this course. She said that if the assumption is the provenance or the original order for that collection will give you maybe some clues as to why it was arranged the way it already was arranged. And if you decide to shift that to something that's easier for you, then when the researcher comes later on, you've taken away some elements of insight that they may have gained from the way that the collection was organized. Did I understand you correctly? Okay. That's a very valid point. Very valid point. Any other thoughts on why this is the preferred method of arrangement? So the question is, how do you tell if they've actually done some work to organize it? I wish you weren't talking about my office. She's saying, what if they're just piles? There are some people that say, leave it in the original chaos. Don't worry about that. Just leave it the way it is and let the researchers dig through it. There are others that say, yeah. There are others that say, well, that's not very effective for the researchers because it doesn't help maximize the amount of time that they're spending in their research. So that's a good question. I think it depends. Do you like that? No. I think there are ways as you're going through and doing the appraisal and doing the survey that you can start to see, okay, these types of materials seem to be very similar and they're grouped together. Maybe they're the folders are labeled alphabetically by certain subjects because they had these subject files about maybe it's an artist that was working on different subjects, and they had them arranged alphabetically as they gained better insight about how they wanted to portray a certain thing. I mean, I like making things up, so that's what that was. So that may be, it just sometimes becomes apparent, oh, this is the way that they arranged it. And then other times you can go through 3 boxes and realize that the stuff in box 3 pertains to the stuff in box 1, but box 2 is completely different. And so obviously it's not in sequential order as the creator originally had it. Does that make sense? Well, and that's a very good question. We will talk about that on the next slide. How's that? No, that's a very good point, though, because I think that's something we all have to grapple with. She said, well, does that mean even if it doesn't make sense to us, do we just leave it the way it is? Is that basically what you were saying? And I think we'll address that in just one second. So one of the questions that I think about consistently is how do I connect collections that are coming in with related materials that are already in our holdings. So if I've got the Department of Athletics sent us stuff that's been in the archives for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. They sent us some more things today. How do I make sure that my researchers know that what they sent today connects with the stuff that's already been here for a long time? What do you think? How do we make those connections? I saw lips movement. That means you got to say something. Or for me, for that matter. Right. Yeah, she mentioned Past Perfect, which is a software program for collection management. So a lot of times that's a very effective way to do it, is to use the collection management software to make those connections. If that collection management software has a public side where the public can then search that reduces a step on your side as well. Then you don't have to do as much to try and connect those materials because the researchers are making those connections on their own because of the description that you did. And Marcella will hit on that later as well. Sure.
That software was too expensive for us, so we made a spreadsheet
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. So there are less expensive methods than Past Perfect. You can find free or already available systems to use. So yes, that's a good example of how to maximize what you have, what your resources are, to provide some level of collection management to your holdings. All right, I think we got to get cruising. I have completely appreciated your input, though. This is good. Goes to hit a little bit more on what we talked about earlier about what do we do when it just looks like it's a mess. Well, sometimes you can just do basic things like alphabetical, numerical, chronological, chaos, whatever order you want at that point. If you cannot figure out any original order, then try and make sense of it on your own. One of the point that I haven't brought up yet, which I want to spend just a second, okay, more than a second on, is intellectual arrangement versus physical arrangement. And this is a concept that has existed a while. It was emphasized by Green and Meisner when they wrote about more product, less process. But they said with a lot of electronic collection management systems today, you can connect things on the computer side, but not necessarily physically. They don't have to be in the same box or next to each other on the shelf. If you're using an effective collection management system, that can make those connections so that all the same types of materials are represented together intellectually. So when the user's looking at the descriptions, they see them together, but physically they're in 10 or 15 different places, and you have to, then it's your fun to go retrieve those 10 or 15 different places, the types of materials that they want. But I wanted to touch on that because that helps. Sometimes in your arrangement, it can speed up the process, because then you don't have to rehouse everything so that all the same types of materials are together. They might be in separate boxes, but you can represent them together to the user. So that's another concept that I wanted to make sure I shared with you. All right. So other factors to consider with your arrangement is the type of material that you have. Because if you've got audiovisual, or you've got, what else do I have there? Oh, I've got a nice stack of boxes that are, thankfully the boxes that are stored there, a lot of those are on a retention schedule, which means they disappear in a few years. So don't worry, those aren't like permanent, really important records. I just thought it was a great photo. So those materials sometimes dictate how you store them though, because you may want to keep all of your audiovisual materials together, all of your 16mm film or 8mm film, you may want to keep in the same place or the same type of storage. You may want to keep all of your photos in the same place. You may not want to intermix everything together. So those are some different things to keep in mind. Part of that can be driven by the environmental requirements. If certain types of materials require a colder setting and you have access to that colder setting, most of us probably don't, but in the dream world, if you did, then you'd want to store those materials together. Do you have space for that, for those things? Is there a specific space set apart for the materials that you're arranging? What types of records they are? If you've got business records, do you want to store all of those together? If you've got family records, do you want to store all those together? Or do you just want to run them sequentially as you receive them and as you process them? And then allow your, like we were talking about a few minutes ago, allow your collection management system to then keep track of where those materials are stored. All right. And then the final thing on there is weeding. So when do you weed materials in your collection? Can you weed? Sometimes by statute you can't for a certain amount of time. So when do you weed? Say that again? Every time you look at a document? Right. Yep. So part of that appraisal process, that could be termed a weeding process because you're figuring out what you don't want or what you do want. And then when you do the survey, you may realize, oh wow, 3 of these boxes duplicate three other boxes that they gave us all at the same time. Or you may realize we already have this material in our collection when we appraised that we wanted these materials. So we weed at almost every stage of the process. Sometimes we have to do a reappraisal. And I think we talked a little bit about that earlier when Sherry was talking about it, but I think that's I know that's something that I have to do in my institution, is look at, were we acquiring things that were not in accordance with the retention schedule? Do we have a bunch of records from the university that we don't really need? That's always a question that we can consider, and then that helps free up space for more appropriate collections.
Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is probably going to sound really familiar, but it all plays together. So, description, which is basically, how does anybody know what we have, and how do we get them to find it? So we're going to briefly discuss some descriptive practices and choosing what amount of description best suits your needs as an institution with limited staff, volunteers, resources, as well as what best suits your users, which is, as we've already noted, often is not the same thing as what best suits you as an institution. But I think the guiding principle that you always want to keep centermost when you're describing any archival collection, and one of the major takeaways that we really want you to get out of this unit on arrangement and description, is adaptability and flexibility. And yeah, like I said, Cliff's already talked about this, but it's still really key. It's still really important. Whatever standards and procedures you set for yourselves as an institution when it comes to description, make sure it's a policy that allows you to adapt to each situation as it presents itself. So the basics of any system of description provide you both intellectual control over the collection and administrative control for your institution, which is getting back to how do you find it and that kind of thing. How do you know where it came from? And that kind of leads into not all information that you are describing is public. Here at the Historical Society, we don't provide acquisition information where we received a collection, unless under very, very special circumstances generally. We might provide custodial history information, that provenance information, where, for an example, one of the major collections we have is the Menninger collection. And the Menninger Foundation archives were initially housed in the Menninger Foundation's archives, and then it came to us, and it's gone through some hands and it's gone through some rearrangement. So we might note that in our description just to describe this is what's happened. It's a very odd, unusual situation. There's been a lot of people holding on to these records, so here you go. We also don't provide information about where exactly our collections are in our stacks. For the most part, we are a closed stacks. We have the reference room, and there are some volumes in there that anybody can access. They can just walk right in. But most things, they have to go through our reference staff to get to. And our reference staff know that that particular box from that particular collection is located at 118111. It's our internal system that we use, but we don't usually give that information out to researchers. We might give it to a specific researcher when they're contacting us, just so that it'll be easier when they get to our site, so that they know I'm looking for this particular collection and I know it's located here. But we don't just put it on the internet for everybody to find. Some other information that we might note in our collections management system, but it's again internal information, it's not public information, is, oh hey, that volume's missing. Or that collection really, really is in terrible physical disorganization and needs to be reprocessed before we give anybody access to it. Yeah, it happens everywhere. So again, that's information we might give to a researcher when they're specifically requesting that collection, usually after we do a really frantic run around to find that missing volume, or we go into the stacks and say, okay, it's 2 boxes, I think I can do it before they come in, reprocess it. But again, it's not information that we're just blasting out there for everybody to see. We just finished a major revamp of our collections management system. It's actually still ongoing, but we just finished a huge portion of it. And this project involved everybody involved in collections management, from the person who does the acquisition, who acquires the materials, through the processing staff, through the digital curation staff. And as we were working on this project, we realized that the one thing we all had in common, that we all start with when working with a collection, plus a couple other pieces of information that's pretty specific to our workflows, is the title. That was it. That was all we needed. Now granted, that's where you start. That's not where you end. But that said, most descriptions that you're doing, especially if you're going with the more product, less process line of thinking, and I was going to be really secretive and not tell you that's what it was called as I was telling you about it, but then Cliff totally blew everything. But the thing is, you're keeping it to a basic. You're keeping it to a minimum. You're not necessarily spending a whole lot of time on it crafting the perfect finding aid to get into that collection, because the point is getting access to the collection. So some other basic things that you're going to want to include in pretty much any description that you do are going to be the dates, the quantity, the types of material, the subjects, the focuses of the material, the arrangement if there's anything, what you've already been thinking about, what you've already been working on as you appraised the collection, as you acquired it, as you arranged it. So this is all what you're going to be writing up now to make all that information available to your researchers. And I'll go into a little more detail now about each of those things. Titles generally indicate who donated the collection and or what the collection or who the collection is about. So it might be the Rosalie Smith papers, or it might be the John Wayne collection compiled by John Smith, or it might be XYZ furniture maker business records. And it's probably going to be something broad like papers or collection or records, something like that, unless it's a very finite specific collection. And even then it might be fairly broad if you're just dealing with a collection of photographs. Dates might be very broad, circa 1890 to 1950, wide range, lots of years in there. Or they might be very specific, 1945 to 1950, 1955, 28th of September, 1808. That's going to depend on how inclusive the date ranges are for the collection and how much time you have to spend with the collection to discover that kind of information. Cliff mentioned earlier a subject files series where maybe it's all nicely alphabetical, but there's no dates on the outside of the folders, and so you're flipping through trying to figure out, well, I think it's about 1960 to 1990. That's perfectly fine. If you're dealing with another set of records, maybe it's meeting minutes for a club that met monthly, and everything's nicely foldered, and all of the folders say exactly what month and year it was, and you notice that 1948's missing. You can note that in your description pretty easily and pretty quickly. Quantity is going to indicate how much you have in the collection. And again, this can be pretty broad, or it can be fairly specific. And what I mean by broad is, if you're dealing with 20 cubic feet, that's all you need to say, maybe. If you're dealing with a much smaller, odder collection, then you might say that you've got 2 microfilm reels, 3 16mm reel-to-reel films, and 45 photographs. You might go into that kind of detail. If you're dealing with 20 boxes of microfilm reels, you might just say it's 20 boxes of 16mm microfilm and leave it at that, rather than counting up every single reel. And quantities kind of play into material type, but when I'm talking about material type, I'm sort of thinking more broadly than just format. I'm also thinking about paper records can be divided into various types of series, such as correspondence or letters. Maybe you've got lots of scrapbooks, maybe you've got sheet music, maybe you've got, like I said, reel-to-reel films. So it's both format and it's also document type is really what I'm thinking about there. And that can run the whole gamut of what people produce in the course of their work and lives. But using some of those keywords like manuscript drafts, correspondence, incoming and outgoing correspondence, those are going to be clues to you and to your researcher. Because if your researcher is looking for sheet music from a composer that you have a collection for, but all you have from that composer is correspondence, they might not want to look at your collection at all and they'll go somewhere else. Subject matter is the biggie. It's probably the main reason everybody's looking at your stuff to find out if they want to go there or not. Title is probably going to be a first clue, but titles aren't that descriptive. So you're probably going to be writing some kind of scope and content note or a summary note. And that's going to be a very brief paragraph probably describing what's in the collection, what types of material are in the collection, what the subjects or topics or the main theme of the collection is. So some examples might be Pottawatomie County's involvement in Kansas's participation in the 1893 World's Fair, or an extension program's records on hog farming and cattle raising, or a young girl's hopes and dreams, daily activities, people she visited, and what she learned in class and family experiences. It's going to be a wide range depending on what kind of information, what kind of materials you collect, and what's important in that collection, because you're also going to be selective about what you describe. You're not necessarily going to describe every single item. It might be that there's a ton of correspondence, letters between Rosalie and her siblings as they dispersed across the United States, but there's just a couple things of, photo postcards or something like that. You might not really describe those, or you might not describe them in very much detail because the bulk of the collection is something else. Arrangement, oh yes, question. Mm-hmm. So the question's about how formal your language should be in your finding aid and what you're describing. And I think that's going to be an institutional decision. And it's going to be a decision of, okay, what's going to be most useful to our researchers? Are they going to understand this is just a sentence fragment, but it's still completely describing the thing? Or are they going to be confused and think, well, what do I do with this? So it's really institutional policy, what suits best. Yes, arrangement. Okay. So yeah, you've gone to all the effort of arranging it, or the original donor went to all the effort of arranging it. You might as well tell people that there is an arrangement. That'll help you and your researchers pinpoint exactly which box or boxes and folder or folders he or she needs to access. And even if it isn't arranged, even if it's still in that chaos, or if the arrangement isn't very clear to you, you can tell that there was some thought going on behind it, but you don't know what it is and you decide to leave it as is. Tell your researchers that. It'll help them. It'll give them a clue, especially in conjunction with the other information that you're providing them. If it's 2 boxes of disorganized materials, that's not nearly as daunting as 20 boxes of disorganized materials. So everything that you're writing up for your researchers plays together and gives them a fuller context for knowing, is this something that I want to try, or do I need to move on to something else? And sometimes you do need to go into more detail. I think Cliff touched upon this briefly. You might need to create container lists. You might need to create folder lists. where you're labeling or where you're typing up something about every single folder in a box. And that's really going to depend upon a wide variety of factors. It's a very detailed level of description, so you might not, you're probably not going to always have the time to do that, but you might choose to do that depending on the significance of the collection, how important having that information is to access that collection, which nicely segues into how much description do you do. And this, again, is really where flexibility and adaptability are going to be key. So some factors that you want to take into consideration: how large is the collection? Is it one scrapbook or is it 50 boxes? Is it a handful of photographs or is it 300 letters? How much arrangement and organization already existed, or how much time have you already invested in that arrangement? And relatedly, is there some kind of index, or is that arrangement useful? Like I mentioned earlier, if you've got an alphabetical arrangement and you say just that, these records are alphabetically arranged, and somebody contacts you and says, hey, I think there might be something in here about Susan Adair, you can probably go to that index or to that alphabetical arrangement and just say, okay, Adair. Nope, there's nothing. Sorry, we can't help you. If it's something chronological and you've got it all nicely in order, or you've intellectually ordered it so that you know that the box from 1901 is over here and the box from 1904 is over here, and they're saying, I want to see something from 1902, you know where to go and look. And it's quick, it's easy. And you don't necessarily have to describe every single piece in that box. You can just say, there is this arrangement. So some other things to think about: how significant is the collection? How likely do you think it'll be accessed by your patrons? Is it an unusual collection? Is it something from a founding member of the community? Is it something from an important Mexican-American family now living in the county? You don't want to just think historically, but you also want to think about contemporary trends, maybe, depending on what your collection development policy is. Is the collection regarding a popular or controversial topic? Maybe it's about water rights in your community. Maybe it's about the orphan train, something like that, where you think there's going to be a lot of interest and a lot of people are going to want to see these materials. Is it restricted from access? Is it going to be restricted for a really long time? If it's going to be restricted until 2050, maybe you don't really spend a whole lot of time on it right now, and you just write up something very brief so that you have some information and move on to the next collection that is now open. Are these archival materials part of a larger donation that includes a lot of objects about to go on display in your museum? Does your institution want to include some of these archival materials as well, because there's some really great photographs or some really great correspondence? So all of these factors, and probably more that we haven't talked about, will go into your decision about how detailed your description needs to be for any given collection, and to what level your intellectual processing needs to go. It's really, really going to depend. If you've got 20 boxes from a women's club, for example, but they're nicely organized, they're nicely arranged, so that you know that the first 5 boxes are all correspondence and the next 6 boxes are all financial records, you might just write up a brief summary note saying, these are the records of this club and this is what it is, and leave it at that. Maybe you've got 5 photographs, and that's it. But these photographs are from 1889, and they're some of the earliest photographs of your community. You might go into some fairly detailed description about each individual photograph because they're really unique, they're really unusual, and they tell you a lot about your community's history. What I hope I've been really emphasizing, not in the case of those photos, unfortunately, is that collective description is key. If you have a strong museum or library background, that might be really anathema to you, that might make you really uncomfortable, but I'm here to tell you it's okay. Collective description is awesome. And it really makes most sense, because that single piece of paper makes a lot more sense and is a lot more contextualized by all the other single pieces of paper surrounding it. They make a more cohesive unit, and you have a fuller, richer understanding of what all of this means together. Now, even in collective description, there are still levels of description, something that we often call a hierarchy. And Cliff started touching upon this with arrangement. The highest level of description and organization within any collection is the collection itself. I'm not talking about repository level, I'm just talking about individual collections. Oftentimes with small collections, and even sometimes with mid-sized or larger collections, You might only describe at the collection level. So you might say something like, this collection consists of 2 scrapbooks and 3 diaries from Rosalie Wilson when she was a child and youth living in Topeka, Kansas during the 1930s and 1940s. You might go into a little more detail about what kind of ephemera are in the scrapbooks or what topics she discussed in her diaries, but that's it. You're not going into any more detail than that. Now, another piece of your finding aid, of your description for this collection might be a biographical sketch, in the case of our friend Rosalie Wilson. So you might try to find some information about her online, or you might try to go through some newspapers to see if there's an obituary, or maybe the donor gave you some information about her, or maybe just whatever you can find in the collection itself. And you'll want to include information like dates of birth and death, if applicable, maybe where she was born and when she moved to your community, if she didn't start out living there, some accomplishments, what she did for a living, names of her children, who she married, that kind of thing. Again, it's oftentimes the biographical sketch, or if you're dealing with organizational records and administrative history, that information that you write in there plays into whatever you're writing into the scope note that's about the specific materials in the collection. Oftentimes when I'm writing something, I'll note that she was part of this club because I found a postcard or an event program from that club. But I won't note that in the scope and content note because there's just 1 or 2 pieces like that. I might note it in her biographical sketch because it was an important part of her life. So the information, again, it interplays. It all plays in together so that there's that fuller context, both in the finding aid as well as in the collection. And I mentioned just a moment ago an administrative history. That would be something that you would write for an organization, for a government entity. And that's going to, again, include information about when it was founded, what purpose it serves, like the Register of Deeds office maintains and preserves the land records of the county, or XYZ furniture maker was, it created cabinetry and kitchen suites, dining room suites in southwestern Kansas, something like that. You might note anything like mergers or subsidiary companies that it bought. The Register of Deeds office, I think, often took over superintendent of public schools records when that local office closed down. The XYZ furniture company might have bought a shoemaking company for whatever reason. And again, it might not be information that you're finding a whole lot of in the collection, but it's an important piece that you found out about of that company's history. And these kinds of biographical sketches and administrative histories can be really brief. They can be 1 sentence. They can be a short paragraph. They could also be really complex, again, depending on how much time you're spending on this collection, on processing this collection. If it's a huge collection, if it's a major collection, you might write a fairly complex short essay. Now for larger collections, and Cliff's kind of touched upon this, I think, you might need separate series descriptions. If you've gone ahead and sorted out, arranged the collection such that, okay, I have all of the correspondence here, I have all of the financial records here, I have all the scrapbooks here. So you might do another scope and content note, another summary note, just for that specific series. You might do something for the collection overall saying it includes these kinds of records or these kinds of materials, and then the specific series you'll go into more detail about the financial records include invoices and bills and budgets and et cetera, et cetera. This can continue throughout all levels of description, some kind of collective summary of whatever piece of the whole that you're describing. And if you're breaking the collection up into multiple series, and if you find yourself creating box or container lists, associate that information with whatever level of description is most appropriate. I mentioned a women's club collection earlier, so if you're going to be listing individual boxes of correspondence, list them with that series. If you're going to be noting that boxes 1 through 5 are correspondence and boxes 6 through 10 are financial records, list that with the collection level record, because that's where it's going to make the most sense to your users probably. So now you created this finding aid, this description of your collection, and it's beautiful and it's great and everything's fabulous. How do you get that information out to your researchers? It's really going to depend on your institution. You're going to want some kind of standardized format or template probably, just to make sure that you check off all the boxes and you get all of the standard information. I know when I was doing a grant project where I was surveying everything at the Historical Society in the State Archives, we would often forget to note dates. So we created a form to make sure that we would note dates of everything, because otherwise we'd have to go back into the stacks, go back through the boxes, figure out, okay, I think it's from the 70s, and that kind of thing. So having that template on hand kind of helps you go, okay, wait, did I forget to do this piece? Whether it's EAD compliant or it's a MARC record going into OCLC and a local public access catalog, that's one thing. And if your institution does that and has the resources to do that, that's great. I'm not going to go into detail about that because you can take entire classes on that. But your institution might not be able to afford those kinds of things. So you might just be doing something in Microsoft Word, or you might be doing something in a spreadsheet. That's still good. That's still information that you have. So you're going to want to note, like I said, those basic pieces of information that I've talked about. You're also going to want to note, like I said, your location information, however your institution says this material is located here. It might be something as simple as room 2A, box 5, whatever system your institution uses. You're also going to want to note that acquisition information. Again, you might not make it public, but that way you can relate back to, okay, this material came from this person at this time. So now that you have kind of the information in a template, now that you kind of have it gathered together, how do you make it publicly accessible? You might just keep it all in notebooks or binders in your reading room. That works. You might keep it all in Past Perfect, which it's been a few years since I used Past Perfect, and it seems to me that it wasn't the greatest for archival description. It was really much more object-oriented descriptions, but that is an option. In cases like that, there's also some other culturally specific database collection management systems that your institution may be able to purchase. Some of them are a little more open source than others and are a little easier to acquire, but might be a little harder to maintain if you don't have good IT staff. Some of those, like if you're using a database or a spreadsheet or something like that, or if you're using Past Perfect, your information might not fit comfortably into that format. So you might find yourself doing a hybrid system where you have some of it in paper and some of it on the computer, or some of it in this database and some of it in this Word document. It's unfortunate. It happens. We've certainly had to do that where we still sometimes use random databases, random spreadsheets to contain information because it doesn't fit into our centralized system very well. And in some of those instances where you've got that information, you can't really give good worldwide access to it for your researchers. It's okay. You still have it somewhere central. You still have good access to it. So when a researcher calls you up or spontaneously shows up at your front door and says, hey, I want to see this about this furniture maker, you can at least go into your system and say, okay, here's what we have. So somehow you're getting that information out there. If you've got a good website, perhaps you can turn your word processing finding aids into PDF documents and put them online. Maybe you don't like using your website, maybe you don't like uploading documents to it. So there's other options like blogging options, WordPress, Tumblr, Blogger, to name a few. I'm not endorsing any of them, but those are free or inexpensive ways to get your information a little more public, a little more out there. I would keep those mostly as public access rather than as your record copy of whatever finding aid you've created because, yeah, well, long-term preservation issues. But at least that way the information's out there for people to find. So there's lots of different ways to create and provide your descriptions to researchers. Don't be overwhelmed. Don't be discouraged. Like we've been reiterating all along, flexibility is key. So I would just say research your options. Talk to other people here, tonight at dinner, tomorrow at lunch, at break. Find out what everybody else is doing and see if it's something, a system that maybe you could work for yourselves. So really, really quickly, I want to talk about records management, both institutional records for your institution as well as records management, especially if you're a government entity. So institutional records management. You're probably not going to be arranging and describing your own institution's records, but it's still a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. That photograph that Cliff pointed out earlier I come back to, of the boxes just piled in a corner that was the museum records. I've been there and I've done that too. You want to save space, not just in your stacks, not just in where you house your collections, but also in your own offices. You want to get rid of those records without long-term value, and you also want to be able to more easily access your own institutional records that are vital to your institution, including your accessioning paperwork, your collection paperwork, maybe information about past exhibits that your institution has done, because that way you know, okay, wait, we don't want to do this exhibit because we just did it 5 years ago. You want to keep, this is a photograph of the construction of this museum that we're standing in right now. And that's really important for your own institution's history. So you want, I know you guys are all strapped for time and resources, but you do want to think about that when you go back to your institutions. And then also for government records, if you have to deal with those, there are retention schedules, and we've touched upon those briefly throughout. A retention schedule is a document, basically. It's describing a series of records that also generally gives an institution guidance about how long those records need to be kept and whether they should be destroyed or kept archivally. In Kansas, county level records are governed by the State Records Board. County level only. That does not include municipal records, township boards, school district boards. You can still look at the county level records for guidance though and figure out, okay, this seems like it's policy correspondence, we better keep it. Or this seems like it's this particular kind of election record that only has to be kept for 1 year, I think we can destroy it. Those kinds of things. So those retention schedules are available on the Historical Society's website. I've got the link there. If you work for the district courts, you know you've got to go to Supreme Court Rule 108, and that is on the Supreme Court's website. Or KHS staff a few years ago found it very confusing, so they put a cheat sheet up on our website that you can also look at for a little interpretation to figure out, okay, do I have to contact any historical society or can I just destroy these? The other nice thing about the retention schedules, if you're working with county or city records or anything like that, is they give you a basic description already. And they give you a little bit of provenance information because you might be able to figure out, well, this probably came from the appraisal department. This probably came from the county works department, it looks like. So that can also be useful that way. So I'm going to end that there very, very quickly. Cliff's, oh, yes, Pat. Yes, and I know KU has worked on their retention schedule, their general retention schedule, and that's available on their website. And Cliff's also working on that, so he's a great resource. Yes, I think that was everything that I wanted to cover on that. Cliff's going to wrap up, and he's going to give you a kind of teaser for tomorrow's first session on preservation.
Talking about preservation, though, we did want to tie into that a little bit, and then we also wanted to point out the amount of overlap that you've probably picked up on today. As we've talked about acquisition and appraisal and arrangement and description and now preservation, we're seeing, wow, some of these things can happen concurrently. Some of these things can happen at different times, but a lot of it you can do at the same time. And that's one way to improve the efficiencies of your organization, is to figure out how to most effectively streamline that process so that you don't have to do it sequentially necessarily. You can do them concurrently. So, all right, basics of preservation during the survey, arrangement, description time. Now, I threw a couple of photos up there from a project that I worked on a few years ago. I don't know if you can tell from where you are, but the photo on the far right and in the middle, that's mold. That's pretty serious. If you are going through records and you see that, do not inhale. Do not lick. Get away. You need to be very careful with moldy materials because some of that mold can be very dangerous to your health and to the health of everybody else around you. So if you come across those types of materials, you have some decisions to make, pretty serious decisions. In that case, we decided, because of the importance of the collection, that we would handle it appropriately, send it off to a conservator, and pay a boatload of money to let them preserve it to the best of their ability, and then allow it to be reintegrated into the collection. So sometimes you make decisions like that. Other times you make decisions, I'm going to make a photocopy, clean off the photocopier when I'm done, and get rid of it. Or sometimes you're going to say, it's not even worth keeping, and just get rid of it. So Other basics that you can think about as you're going through to do your survey or your arrangement is, are the staples or the paper clips, are they rusty? Are they causing, are they making it more difficult to see what's underneath them, or to leaving rust marks on other pages that are near them? Are the folders in decent shape? Are the boxes falling apart? Do we need to worry about rehousing them? Because that can help you know what resources you're going to need to spend to better house your collections. Do you need to unfold all the letters, or do you just leave them folded up in the envelopes? Do you need to use some mylar, some plastic sleeves to protect some of those things that are most important in your holdings, or are you just going to leave them all together? Do you want to use tissue paper, buffered tissue paper, to better protect things that are from acidity and all the other issues that are contained there? And then the flip side of that is remembering the concepts of basic processing so that you can get things accessible to your users. If it takes much longer to handle those things and deal with the basic preservation concepts, then it may not be worth it. In the Green and Meisner article, they talked about there hadn't really been any research to verify the importance of protecting from acidity because due to environmental conditions. Basically, if you have good environmental conditions in your storage area, there hasn't been a study done to effectively show that acid migration occurs between papers during that time. So they were throwing out the other side of the coin. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going through the process. And then I've talked about one of the red flags, which is the mold. Another one is insects. I'm not going to tell you the story, but afterwards, if you want to hear a story about insects, talk to me about it. But if you come across insects in your holdings while you're going through it, you may want to mitigate that before you continue processing the collection. And then there's water damage. Sometimes that'll cause photos to stick together. It'll cause negatives to stick together. All of those things you have to take into consideration as you process your collections. And then security. That's just I don't believe they're going to talk about security in the preservation section tomorrow, but really what you want to do is you want to have secured storage spaces because that's going to, the whole purpose of your existence is to share with your users what you have. If those materials disappear, you can no longer share them with your users. So that's an important concept, is to figure out a way to provide a level of security that does not look like Fort Knox, but is secure enough that it will protect what you've got. We talked about confidential records, so a way to make sure that it's clear what's confidential and what needs to be restricted for X number of years. We talked for a minute about environmental controls. That helps with your security because it helps things to last longer. And then you need to consider the researcher volunteer staff use. How are they handling the materials? Do you need to have some policies in place, some training that occurs so that they can handle the materials in a way that helps prolong the life of the material? All right, are you feeling overwhelmed? You've only been through 4 hours of it and you're already feeling overwhelmed? That's understandable. What I thought I wanted, if you're willing to talk for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever it takes, what have you learned and what are you going to do? I feel like when I go to workshops, I want to walk away knowing, what am I going to do now that I've heard all this stuff? What have I learned from it and what can I do? Oh man, I won't be here tomorrow, so I won't be able to hear all of your insightful comments. So think about that tonight so that you can be prepared for the quiz tomorrow. Thank you very much for your time, and let us know if you've got questions.